Former PM Kevin Rudd is president of the Asia Society and a former diplomat in Beijing. I spoke to him earlier about the extraordinary events due to take place in China, which mark the culmination of Xi Jinping's relentless centralisation of power and the possible consequences for Australia. Kevin Rudd, welcome to the programme.
Good to be back, Sarah.
How significant is this moment if, as expected, Xi is appointed for a third term?
Well, having looked at party congresses of the Chinese Communist Party now since the early 80s, I'd say it's the most significant party congress in 40 years. And that's because Xi Jinping's breaking the two-term limit. He's become China's paramount leader. Collective leadership principles have been pushed to one side, and therefore the sacred writ of this single leader matters on all central questions of economic policy, foreign policy and security policy. So that's why it's important, not just in terms of personnel arrangements, but also the ideology which will be reflected in his work report to the Congress and giving us an insight into the future directions on the economy and China's view of the outside world.
Are we looking at him now then as a leader for life?
I believe so, and there's a reason for that. Breaking the two-term limit is significant in itself. Also, if you look at the surrounding emerging evidence of a new cult of personality of a type that we haven't really seen since Mao, suggests that we have Xi Jinping for the very long term. But also because he's been such a formidable Machiavellian politician in eliminating all forms of internal political opposition to him within the party. And in the world of realpolitik, the brutal realpolitik of a Leninist party, if he were to step down, he could not guarantee that he wouldn't be taken out by those who he's alienated on the way through. So I think we should buckle up for the rest of the 20s and the 30s, because I think he's with us for the very long term.
Now, previous leaders had moved away from this concentration of power in one person, protecting China from the emergence of a second Mao. How did Xi get his colleagues to agree?
Well, he spent his first term between 2012 and 2017 conducting one of the biggest internal party purges that we've seen since Mao. Often not fully reported in the West, but wave after wave of taking out so-called anti-party cliques, but also an anti-corruption campaign and later a party rectification campaign, which has cut a swathe through the rest of the Communist Party ranks, producing effectively something of a reign of terror within the operation. So therefore, if there was significant opposition during his first term, and there was some, by the time we get to the beginning of his second term in 2017, most of that had fallen by the wayside. And so therefore, he's been in a position to assert these fundamental systemic changes that we've seen on the question of his paramount leadership as opposed to collective leadership.
What does this mean for the prospects for Taiwan?
Well, I think we're now on a timeline for Taiwan, and I don't say that idly, because when Xi Jinping uses the phrase, the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, becoming the region's and the world's preeminent power by 2049, he's also now on the record as saying that can't be achieved in the absence of reunification with Taiwan. That is new compared with his predecessors who had perfected the art of pushing the Taiwanese can down the road. What's my own assessment is that we're not looking at the prospect of China moving militarily against Taiwan in the 2020s. And the reason for that is because China at this stage is not sufficiently confident of its military capability that there would not be a risk that it would lose against the US, Taiwan and/or its allies in such a conflict. I think Xi Jinping's preferred timetable is the 2030s, by which time he would still be in power. He's got good genes. His mother's still alive at the age of 96. He hopes to further open up a military gap against the United States and Taiwan over the next 7 years or so, and hopes to financially and economically insulate China against the risk of global sanctions against China of the type that we have seen applied to Russia because of its invasion of Ukraine.
This Congress does coincide with China's worsening economic situation, something that the younger generation of Chinese are not accustomed to. How much does the slowing of the Chinese economy cobble his power?
Well, Sarah, you're right. I've written for some time now that I believe the economy represents Xi Jinping's Achilles heel. And it's slowing for several sets of reasons. There's the overhang of demography. Countries getting older. The birth rate is now 1.16, the second lowest in Asia. Beginning to have a shrinking population, and for some years now, a shrinking workforce. That's demography. But then there's this second factor, which is the overhang of ideology. And as he's moved the center of gravity of Chinese economic policy in the last 5 years to the Marxist-Leninist left, then the Chinese private sector has begun to reduce its enthusiasm for continued fixed capital investment in the economy. Add to that zero COVID lockdowns, you have the economy barely bumping along at maybe 2 or 3% at the moment. And this may prove to be secular and structural for the long term, rather than just temporary because of COVID. This is his Achilles heel, and he would need to execute a significant ideological U-turn or change in this 20th Party Congress in order to remove this ideological impediment to growth that he's imposed for the last 5 years.
Why do you think that the Chinese, through their ambassador here, have been making overtures towards a better relationship with Australia? Is it genuine, and does it come from Xi himself?
China's general strategy for diplomacy and foreign and security policy does come from numero uno. That's the way in which the system is structured these days in Beijing. It's not just random acts by ambassadors, or let alone policy frolics by the Chinese Foreign Ministry. These are calibrated internally and at the centre for all countries, not just us, by the way. I think in Australia's case also, Sarah, it's been helpful that we've seen from Prime Minister Albanese, the Foreign Minister Penny Wong, and Defence Minister Richard Marles a predisposition to put the megaphone away and not to scream and shout at Beijing every second Tuesday morning in order to get something off their chest, a la Morrison and Dutton. That, I think, has helped in stabilisation.
A very interesting few days ahead in Beijing. Thank you very much indeed for sharing your expertise.
Good to be with you, Sarah.